turning to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, that's going to be where we are tonight. Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to quickly review through some of the earlier material of Hebrews, some background reminders. We get ready for chapter 12 here tonight, and then we'll cover chapter 12. We're quickly coming to an end of Hebrews. Just a reminder, we'll keep going in order of where they are. We'll finish Hebrews, and we'll go from Hebrews to James after that. I hope to have the James material done here perhaps by Sunday. Been working on material for the book of James, and so we'll try to have that out here hopefully Sunday. Perhaps we'll finish Hebrews on Sunday. It depends on how far we get in chapter 12 today as well as 13. But we're quickly closing in on James, and so again, I'll try to have that material for James ready here shortly. The book of Hebrews, the theme of Hebrews, as we've been saying, is about Christ is better. So that's the key verse is chapter 1 and in verse 4, talking about how Christ is so much better than the angels. And so as you go throughout the book, that's what it's emphasizing, particularly in the first 9.5 chapters. And so chapter 1 through chapter 10:18 is about that superiority of Christ, or Christ being better, depending on your translation as to what word it uses in chapter 1, verse 4. So what it points out in the first 9.5 chapters is that Christ is better than is superior to the prophets in the first 3 verses of chapter 1. He's superior to angels in the rest of 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 3, superior to Moses. Most of chapter 4 is he offers a superior rest. Then the last few verses of 4 through chapter 7 is his superior priesthood. Chapter 8, he brings a superior covenant. This new covenant has a superior sanctuary to that of the old, chapter 9, 1 to 14. And in the rest of 9, and in the first part of chapter 10 through verse 18, is his superior sacrifice. His sacrifice is superior to that of the old law. We then have this more practical application section, if you will, that we've been in on don't give up, there is no other way. Again, we're dealing with Christians on the verge of giving up. And so as the Hebrew writer's writing here, reminding them, don't give up, what he spent the first 9.5 chapters doing is telling them, you're on the right path. And so what 19 through chapter 13 is about is you keep on the path you're on, because if you go off that path, guess what? There's nowhere else to turn. Chapter 10, 26, where it talks about if we sin deliberately, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, because if we reject the sacrifice of Christ, the only perfect sacrifice, the sacrifice that can take away sin, where else are we going to turn? We can't. And that's what he's focused on here. So the rest of 10, keep the faith. Chapter 11 that we covered our last couple of times was looking to examples of faith. We're in chapter 12, endure in faith. Then chapter 13 is application of faith. That is, here's how that practically looks in the everyday walk of life. Now let's go through our chapter content here. In our first, this slide has our first 9 chapters. Chapter 1, Christ is superior to prophets and angels. Chapter 2, he's superior to angels. That thought continued, but pointing out this time in that he's divine human. Chapter 3, he's superior to Moses, and do not be disobedient. Chapter 4, he offers a superior rest. Chapter 5 is he's a superior high priest. And again, chapter 6, the exhortation to go on to perfection. That's our parenthetical statement, if you will, from the end of 5 into chapter 6, where he stops, says, you're immature, let me deal with that. Now let me go back to this previous discussion. Chapter 7, that discussion continued of Christ's superior priesthood. Chapter 8, a superior ministry, that is high priestly ministry. He brings a superior covenant. Chapter 9, the old covenant was a type of the new, talking about that sanctuary being a type of the sanctuary under the new. And then talking about the sacrifice, paralleling those under the old law to those under the new law. Chapter 10, the superior sacrifice and the exhortation of faithfulness. So that sacrifice from 9 continued into chapter 10. And he exhorts them to faithfulness in the latter half. Chapter 11 we called the Hall of Faith. We haven't got to these yet. We're covering 12 tonight. The exhortation of endurance and the practical exhortations. So chapter 12, the exhortation to endurance. So we get into chapter 12. The key verse is verse 1. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So let's get to chapter 12 here. Keeping that verse in mind, there's a couple of questions we've got, or two questions over that here. Go to your questions here. Hebrews chapter 12, question number 1. Briefly summarize the chapter. Somebody says, what's Hebrews 12 about? You give them a sentence or two. What do you say about chapter 12? What's it about?
Running with patience.
Running with patience or endurance there, so you're right. That's the early part, and that's really the main focus is about endurance as a whole throughout this chapter. And again, we're dealing with an audience who is on the verge of giving up, and what chapter 12 is reminding them and encouraging them to do is to endure in the face of these persecutions they're facing. More about that in a minute. Question number 2. Who's the cloud of witnesses? We're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, verse 1. Who's the cloud of witnesses? Those of Hebrews 11. Verse 1, therefore we also. Now remember, we just ended chapter 11 with we have something better. But before we ended on that statement was, here's all these examples of faith. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, I think he's talking about those of chapter 11. Here are those around who we can look to and say, you know what, I did it in the midst of difficulties. And if I did it, you can do it too. Now as we get into, we'll go back to question 3 here in just a moment. As we get into chapter 12 here, it divides down into 4 sections. Each of these is a section about some type of exhortation. The first one is that exhortation to run with endurance. Which again, the whole chapter is about enduring and a number of exhortations to help them endure, but specifically in 1 to 3, he uses the terminology of running. He's comparing it to a race. There are 2 subpoints under that. The first is look to the cloud of witnesses. That is, look at those around who've already finished their race. But the second and the more important one is look to who? To Jesus, who's the author and finisher of our faith. So you could look to those who've done it before, and again, you look at somebody like Abraham or Noah. Take Noah as an example. And we look at ourselves and say, well, things are difficult and the world around us is wicked, and look at what the world's engaging in. How can we do it? And then we can look, and there's Noah who says, keep this in mind. I think we forget this sometimes. I raised 3 children who got on the ark with me in the 120 years from the time the flood was promised. I think we forget that sometimes because of how old Noah was when he went on the ark. Go back and look at the dates of when the flood was promised, when the flood was sent, and at what age Noah had his 3 sons. Those 3 sons were born between the time that God said, I'm going to send a flood, and the time the flood came. When the thoughts of men's heart were wicked continually. And guess what Noah did in that 120 years? He raised 3 children who he convinced to get on the ark with them, who then chose wives who got on the ark with them too. And so we look around and say, it's a wicked world. How can we be faithful? How can we raise faithful children? There's Noah who says, I did it. You can do it too. We say, well, how about these difficulties of life? And, and things in these trials we may be asked to do. And there's somebody like Abraham who left his homeland and he went to a land he did not know. Somebody that was willing to sacrifice his son. We think about sin and the pleasures of sin and think, well, I need to give up sin, but maybe we find pleasure in something. And there's Moses who says, I forsook the riches of Egypt and the passing pleasure of sin and suffered instead because his focus was on his service to God. We can look to the cloud of witnesses who are around us, who we can look to and say, you know what, I did it and you can do it too.
Flood and then the flood came. He put up with ridicule from the world for 120 years. You're building an ark? Yeah, they made fun of him. His kids heard that. But yet they went on the ark with him. So he did good.
You're right, You're right, and I think it is another testament to the teaching that Noah did. Sometimes we make this statement, and it's Noah preached for 120 years and didn't win any converts. That's not completely true. He won no converts on the outside. He won his family. He won his wife, his children, and his children's spouses. So he was successful in his own household, even if he wasn't to those outside. So you're right. We looked at some of those examples, and it tells us when he faced that ridicule about the kind of teaching he had offered. Verse 1 now, as he talks about, we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Sometimes when you're reading a commentary, a commentary about this verse, some commentators will talk about weights, and when you finish reading about weights, you're going to ask this question: what's the difference in a weight and a sin? Because if you hear the way that some explain it, they explain a weight as if a weight's a sin. There's a difference. The Hebrew writer here, by inspiration, is drawing a contrast between a weight and a sin. There are two things to lay aside. Sin, that Hebrew word, or that Greek word rather, hamartia, means to miss the mark. Right? You think about if somebody's playing darts or shooting at a target, and you're trying to hit it in the middle, and you completely miss the target, you miss the mark. That's the idea of sin. God has set out, here's what my law is, and when we don't abide by that, we've missed the mark. That's what sin is. That's not what a weight is. Question number three. What is a weight? If it's not the same as sin, what's a weight?
Something that weighs you down, bows you down.
Something that weighs us down or slows us down. The New American Standard uses the word, I believe, encumbrance. Let's lay aside every encumbrance. BDAG, a lexicographer, says of this Greek word translated weight, it's that which hinders one from doing something. A weight, a burden, an impediment. And so the idea of a weight, and I've used this illustration before. If we were getting ready to run a 5K tomorrow, and the rule book states you can take with you water. You can carry water with you, and you show up. Maybe you've got, one of those running belts on. You've got a water bottle in, or you've got one you got in your hand, and you're all ready to run. And I show up with a 5-gallon jug of water on my back. You might look at me and say, Micah, you're crazy. You're not going to be able to run with that on. I could reply with, well, it's not against the rules. Let's use that. Go back to sin again. Sin is missing the mark. That's what that word means. So let's use the illustration with the rules. You're running and competing in something, and Paul uses this illustration back in 2 Timothy. When one competes in athletics, you compete according to the rules. If you don't, you've missed the mark of the rules, right? So you can't say, well, you're going outside the rules, right? You've missed the mark of what the rules have said. I'm running with water. That's the rule. But guess what? A 5-gallon jug of water is really going to weigh me down. That's the idea of a weight. It's not that it's something inherently wrong. It's not like sin. It's not something that you could say, you know what, that's wrong, but it may become a hindrance that slows us down from being.
Yes. I don't know, Mike, if it's a real biblical example, but it kind of reminds me of Martha and Mary. You know what I mean? Martha was concerned about serving good. That's what Jesus said, we're come to do, to serve others. But Mary was there sitting and learning or whatever, so it's serving good, but learning is better. So, that kind of comes to my mind, last side that's serving grasp the spiritual water, so to speak.
You're right. You're right. And I think that's a great example. I think it's one of the best examples in scriptures of the idea of a weight. And it tells me something, by the way. When you look at Martha and what she's doing there, not only was what Martha doing not inherently wrong, what she was doing was showing hospitality, something that is not just not wrong, it's something that is commanded, right? But she allowed that to become a distraction from service to God, which tells me weights can become anything, including things that are necessary. It's just they can't get out of order. And that's what happens with a weight, is not that it's wrong in and of itself, but it's something that if we're not careful, our priorities get out of order, and it's pulling us back. So what the Hebrew writer says here is, we lay those aside, the weights, right? The impediments, the burdens. We lay aside sin as well. That one, again, the missing the mark. We lay aside anything that puts us outside of the doctrine of Christ. You put those aside, and you run with endurance the race that is set before you. Now, a reminder here again, as we're dealing with this crowd, with this specific audience, this audience here is an audience of people that are Christians that, again, if you go back to what is said earlier in chapter 10, along with some of the other things we've mentioned that we can't say 100% for certain, but it would seem that perhaps again, that we're taking a little bit of speculation here, but evidence suggests they're in the area of Palestine and perhaps the church at Jerusalem. If it is the church at Jerusalem, think of everything they've gone through from the early church, from the establishment of the church in the book of Acts, where they're chased out and they flee the city and they go about and they continue to teach and all of these other things. Even, by the way, if it's not them, evidence does suggest that somebody in Palestine, that whole area faced persecution. Not necessarily to the extent Jerusalem did, but they all in that area were facing persecution. And they've come through, and as the Hebrew writers pointed out in chapter 10, here are people that have come through and have proven themselves in the past, right? Here are people who have had endurance in the past, and he encouraged them at the end of chapter 10, and here again, to keep having endurance. Verse 32, but recall the former days of which after you were enlightened or illuminated, you were endured a great struggle with suffering. You've already struggled and suffered, and you came through that, but it's not enough to come through the first suffering. If there's a second suffering, a third suffering, however many times we suffer for the cause of Christ, you go through that too, and that's the point he's making. You keep running with endurance. You've been struggling and straining and running, and the idea of that word there is to exert oneself, to run or to rush for progress. You've already exerted yourself in running the Christian race, and you keep exerting yourself. I've used this before, and others have used it too. The Christian race is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And if you're running a marathon and you get to mile 20, you still got to go 6.2 more miles to get to the finish line. And in fact, I wouldn't know this. I never made it past 3 whenever I did run. But I've heard that when you get there, it takes all the more effort the closer you get to the end. I heard somebody telling a story of running one where they talked about the first 10 miles or so, 8 to 10 miles, you're setting your pace. The next one, you're rushing with your legs, and the rest is all heart to get to the end. Because you're worn out, you're exhausted, but you've got to cross that line. That's that way spiritually. Sometimes we go through and we think, we've been through the trials, we've exerted ourselves, there's still more effort to give. The finish line is yet ahead, and we've got to push on to that and have need of it.
Paul wrote and said, don't grow weary in well-doing, because of due season you will reap if you faint not. And that exhortation there is something we probably all need at times. You maybe run a race for a lot of years, you are growing tired or whatever like that, and then that hurts to tell someone, hey, don't grow weary in well-doing, because that reward's waiting for you.
You're right, and I don't say it's not that it's not an accomplishment, but do you know what? If somebody runs 26.1 miles of a marathon and quits 0.1 miles short, they've run as many marathons as somebody that's never gotten off the couch to start a marathon. Now, they've obviously in a lot better shape than somebody that's never started, but my point is, you can't say I finished a marathon until you cross the finish line. You can't finish the race until you cross the finish line, spiritually speaking, and that's why Paul could say that. And so there's that need for endurance. Now, in need for endurance, we don't just look to the cloud of witnesses, but as we mentioned earlier, we look to Jesus. Looking unto Jesus, the author or originator and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your soul. So again, when you think about the example of Christ, he's the founder or the author and finisher of our faith. He was the this comment here is by McAllister in his commentary on Hebrews. He's the founder of faith, not in the sense that he was the first person to have faith in God, but he was the first one to finish the course of faith all the way into heaven itself and receive the heavenly reward. He has blazed the full length of the trail before us, showing us the way to reach the same goal ourselves. You look to his example and the example he set. Now, we talk about the others in the Old Testament, but he set the path, right? Jesus said, I am the way. He showed us the way. He set the way. He ran that race, and he showed us how to do it. He's the author and finisher. He's ran it too. And we look to him as that example. 4, verse 3, consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. Think about what Christ went through for us, is the point of verse 3. Consider the hostility against him, lest you become weary and discouraged. And again, he uses there of Christ, consider him who endured. What are we to do? Have endurance. Consider Christ who endured. Remember this, Christ endured all of that for us, so we then can endure suffering for him and for serving him. Now that brings us to our next point, which is really focusing on that idea of suffering. Let me go back here. The exhortation to endure the chastening from the Lord. That's the point of 4 to 11. Two main things I think he's pointing out here about the chastening. Number one, it's a sign of love in 4 to 9. And then secondly, it has value. We may not realize the chastening of the Lord has value, but chastening has value, 10 to 11. Verse 4 now. You have not yet resisted the bloodshed, striving against sin. Now let's stop there. We're in the point about love, but I think this is an important point to understand in verse 4. Consider verse 3 again, and then what he ties it in as he talks about us enduring chastening. Consider Christ, who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. Now we don't have to go back. They don't have to recall back all the way when they first learned. Throughout this book, the suffering of Christ has been pointed to and what he went through. He endured the cross, verse 2, despising the shame. So when you think about what he said in 2 and 3 is, consider Christ who endured, who became the author and the finisher of our faith, and everything he went through for us, and then remember, you've not yet resisted the bloodshed. Christ gave his life for us. Now, are these people suffering for the cause of Christ? Absolutely they are. But you know what? They haven't given their life yet in service to God. Their life hasn't been taken from them. You've not yet resisted the bloodshed. And the point is, you haven't suffered to the fullest extent of which you can suffer for the cause of Christ as he suffered for you. You've not yet resisted the bloodshed. So that's a reminder there that it's not just enduring the suffering. You endure the suffering to the fullest extent, if that's what it takes to endure the suffering. Endure it all the way to the point of death, which is the point that is being made in Revelation 2:10 there. Be faithful unto death. It's not be faithful till you die, though that's true. It's be faithful to the point of dying for the cause of Christ.
He said he saw Jesus. In this case, he wasn't sitting. He was actually standing, and I don't know how to really put all that in proper context, but it's almost like Jesus was urging him to keep on keeping on. I mean, I just think about that. We read about the people in the Old Testament, but we actually have those people since the New Testament church came into existence, but also gave their life for the cause of Christ.
You're right, and I think, by the way, on the note of Stephen, I think that also shows the care and concern that Christ has for his people, and the fact that the only time he's not seated at the right hand is when Stephen was being stoned. Verse 5 now. So as he's reminding them here of their need to endure, he's pointing out that it's a sign of love, which is what he's building to here. But he says, you've not yet resisted the bloodshed, verse 4. Verse 5, and you've forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of the spirits and live? The point that he's making here, first in quoting from the Old Testament, which, by the way, writing down your quotations, 5 and 6 is from Proverbs 3, 11 and 12. Proverbs 3, 11 and 12 is the quotation there in verses 5 and 6. But he goes back in quoting from the Old Testament and points out, don't despise the chastening or discipline of the Lord. Don't be discouraged by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens. And by the way, here's something important that perhaps we may read through and we may read through and talk about, we need to endure suffering and we're going to suffer chastening. This chastening he's talking about is unique to only those who are children of God. Now, others may suffer in other ways, but specifically what's under consideration here is the chastening or discipline of sons, because he says in verse 6, for whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. So whatever the suffering under consideration is, it's not just suffering as a whole. Is there a sense in which people of the world may suffer? Yes. But whatever's under consideration is a suffering unique to the children of God, which would be, which I think we can bring it back to this point, the suffering, I think specifically under consideration, is not just suffering unique to the children of God, it's suffering because you are children of God. That's the suffering unique to the children of God, is suffering because they are his children. And he talks about there, and talking about that chastening and suffering, he said, don't despise it. Don't be discouraged by it when you're rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens. Verse 4, if you endure chastening, God deals with you as sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? Now, what he does here in Hebrews chapter 12 is he begins to parallel the relationship between us as children of God with our heavenly Father as us with our earthly father. Whom, what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, and you're illegitimate and not sons. Parents, at least it used to be pretty much much more foregone conclusion than it is now, discipline their children. And the reason for that we'll get to in a moment, but it's to teach and to help teach one as they're growing up. But parents discipline their children. Specifically, he's using the illustration of father, comparing it to our heavenly Father. But if you're without chastening, of which all have become partakers, I don't think the sense there is all of all people, all as in all the sons of God have become partakers, then you're illegitimate and not sons. Somebody may claim to be a child of God, but if they don't receive the chastening from the Lord, the point is, you're not truly that child that you thought you were. Here's these people going through chastening, and some, perhaps, and I think when you take parallel this way, perhaps some who are here and going through this. And again, I think this is the church at Jerusalem. We're just a few years away. I think when we gave the date at 63 to 67 AD, we are, 3 to 7 years or something like that, 4 days, something like that from Jerusalem being destroyed in 70, and persecution is picking up. And if it's after 64, by the way, which most of the dates we have 63 to 67, would lean more towards later. If it's after 64, it's after the burning of Rome, which means persecution is already picked up even before Jerusalem's destroyed. And you're suffering, and you say, I'm a Christian, and I'm willing to suffer, and then when the trials come, you don't end up suffering, perhaps because you caved, then you're not the faithful son that you thought you were. You need to endure the suffering. Furthermore, verse 9, we have human fathers who correct us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of the spirits and live? I'm going to go ahead and get 10 and 11 on this point of the value, and then we'll come back and mention verse 9 more. I'm going to tie those together. For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seems best to them. But he for our profit, that we may become partakers of his holiness. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, after it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So when you take what's going on here in 9 and 10, he again goes back to the illustration of human fathers. We had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. What he's reminding them of here is that when you were growing up, you would have been disciplined if you did something you weren't supposed to do. In that moment, verse 10, or verse 11, it was not joyful. How many people, somebody's hand goes up, I'm going to be shocked, I'm going to ask you to please explain further. How many people here, when growing up, received discipline? I'm not talking about now, but when growing up, received discipline and thought, you know what? I'm so glad my parents are disciplining me. Nobody received that and in the moment said, you know what? I'm joyful for that. Now, and you don't have to raise your hand, you can if you want to, how many people looking back say, I'm glad they disciplined me? Right? Because that helped shape us to where we are, right? That discipline those formative years, the discipline received is what shapes us to be who we are. Let me say this as a side note. I think that's the problem with our society. A large part of the problem with our society today is that there's no longer any discipline that's taking place. And when you don't discipline and teach respect for parents, there's not respect. I know somebody that's a school teacher who a student wouldn't listen and told them to do something, and they looked at him and said, I don't listen to my parents. What makes you think I'm going to listen to you? And you know, and I don't have to know anything else about that child's background to tell them that child needed a few more spankings growing up, right? That child needed to have some more discipline because that discipline teaches that respect. But looking back, you may not have appreciated it when you were getting it in the moment, but you look back now and you say, you know what, I appreciate that discipline. Here's the point. Look at verse 10. For they, that is our earthly fathers, indeed for a few days chastened us as seems best to them. Let me ask this question. Looking back growing up or raising your children, was there ever a time that a mistake may have been made in discipline? Maybe discipline should have been practiced that wasn't. Maybe there was a chance where there wasn't a need for discipline, but discipline was practiced. Is anybody going to get it perfect? No, there's no such thing as a perfect parent. But those decisions are made as we see best in disciplining, and as our parents saw best in disciplining us. But now for our profit. Guess who doesn't make mistakes in discipline and chastening? It's God, right? It's God. And what He's done is for our profit, that we may be partakers of His holiness. We can be partakers of His holiness. How? If we endure through the chastening of the Lord. Now, no chastening, again, verse 11, seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Going through the suffering, do you think the people at Jerusalem, when they were chased out of Jerusalem, were just overly zealous or joyful about the fact that they were suffering in that sense? They may have been glad they could suffer for Christ, like the apostles. But do you think there was an excitement about actually suffering, the act of going through that? No. Again, they may have been joyful for the reason they suffered. And I think we understand there's a difference. The discipline itself may not, or whatever one may go through, may not be the most joyful thing, but there can be joy because of why we're going through it. That may not seem joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterwards, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. I'd point you to the book of James, which, again, Lord willing, we'll get to here soon, where he talks about the benefits of trials. And that's what we'll see when we get to chapter 1. About my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. There may not be joy in that moment you need to have joy in trials because you realize what's coming to the end. The point is, you need to understand the end of it. That trial, there may not be joy in the trial itself when you're going through it, but knowing why you suffer and the result of that is what brings the joy and can help bring one through the chastening of the Lord, knowing the fruit of righteousness that's produced by those who've been trained by it. Just like we're disciplined by our parents, and what it results is how we end up growing up, and who we end up being is shaped by that discipline. The same is true spiritually when we endure the chastening of the Lord.
An example of what you talk about in the early book, Acts, maybe chapter 5, when Peter and them were told about the preaching name of Jesus. Twice, actually, the second time they were beaten for it. And it says they did rejoice because they were able to suffer for the cause of Christ. Well, like you said, the beating, that would be crazy to think they actually enjoyed whatever that beating entailed. But like you said, the fact that it was a cause of the fact that they were suffering for doing God's will. That's kind of an example in your mind of what you're talking about there.
Hey, you're right. You know, and I think let's parallel to this. If the time comes that we're cast into prison for teaching the truth, we may not be glad we're sitting in a prison cell, but be glad for the reason that they put us there, and that it's suffering for the Lord. Let's go ahead and get down here to verse 12. Verse 12 through 17. The exhortation of greater diligence. We're not going to be able to finish the chapter. We're going to try to get through 17, and then we'll hit the end of 12, and then start in 13. 13 is a long list of exhortations, so it may take us a couple classes to get through 13. So we'll finish 12 then on Sunday and get into the start of 13 then. But let's go ahead and get 12 through 17. The exhortation to greater diligence. Verse 12 and 13, strengthen the weak. Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight the paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather be healed. So what he's telling them then is strengthen the weak. You know, he's actually quoting from Isaiah 35:3, which talks about strengthening the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. That's a quotation from the Old Testament. The point he's making, I think, again, we talk about this. When you see words like for and therefore, we need to go back. Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down. Wait, why? Why is the Hebrew writer saying strengthen the hands which hang down? There's going to be chastening. If you're a child of God, you're going to endure the chastening from the Lord. That chastening yields fruit when you're trained by it. So what do you need to do when somebody's weak and feeble and they're on the verge of giving up and not enduring the chastening? You need to strengthen them so they endure the chastening, so the fruit they can yield that fruit that comes from it. That's the point he's making. So you need to strengthen the hands which hang down, make straight the paths for your feet, so that what is lame will not be dislocated, but rather be healed. Those that are weak, strengthen up. Those that maybe start to teetering and may have be off, not living as they need to, we've got to get them back to living right and help them endure that chastening too. 14 and 15, pursue peace and holiness. But pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Looking carefully, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness spring up, cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. It talks about pursuing peace with all people, verse 14. Now, as is pointed out in Romans, that's as much as it depends on us. We're willing to live peaceably with all men, but like in this case, they're suffering persecution. Not all men are necessarily going to live peaceably with us, but as much as depends on us, as Romans will point out, live peaceably with all. We need to have holiness. That word holiness, the idea of being set apart, sanctified, different. We live different from the world. If we don't, we can't see the Lord. That's the point of verse 14. 15, looking carefully lest anyone fall short. My understanding of that idea of looking carefully lest anyone fall short, the idea there is the idea of a caravan. Nowadays, we don't really use caravans, but you think about, you read through the history books and the traveling, when people were traveling out west to settle the western part of the United States, and they would be in a caravan. If somebody started to fall behind, somebody else in that caravan could take notice of that. If somebody in front of you started to lag behind and you're behind them, you can help notice that. My understanding is the idea of look careful lest anyone fall short. It's the idea of a caravan. We're looking out for one another to make sure nobody's falling behind in enduring that chastening of the Lord. Make sure nobody's falling behind and being what they need to be. Verse 16 and 17, I think the point here, keep an eye out for sin. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. He's talking about Esau and his treatment of that blessing. Talks about Esau and describes him as a fornicator and a profane or godless person. Somebody who had a birthright, which was quite the privilege for the oldest child, and he treated that as if it was nothing. And so he sold that for a morsel of food. Then afterward, Esau wanted that birthright back, but as pointed out, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance. You look at Esau and the kind of person he was. Here's a man that tried to kill his brother, wanted to kill his brother. Now later on, he had a little better attitude when his brother came back, but he sought to kill his brother, who had a bad attitude towards it. And the point I think that the Hebrew writer is making here is he's talking about this idea of greater diligence. When there's somebody that's weak, you strengthen them. You need to make sure y'all are pursuing peace. Make sure you're living separate from the world. Make sure nobody's falling behind. And part of making sure nobody's falling behind is keep an eye out for sin. If you see your brother or sister in sin, not just if you see yourself in sin, you need to deal with that. But if you realize somebody else is in sin, then you need to help them, lest there be anybody that's profane, a fornicator, profane like Esau, to make sure they're on the right path. Because again, we're trying to live separate from the world. We're trying to have holiness. If we don't have holiness, we can't see the Lord. We can't be with Him in heaven. And so the point here, as he talks about greater diligence, is strengthen the weak, pursue peace and holiness, and keep an eye out to make sure that nobody's in sin. So you can come through that chastening of the Lord. You can get the fruit out on the other side of enduring that chastening, and you can have that ultimate reward of going to heaven. Now, our time has gotten away from us this evening, so again, Lord willing, we'll pick up at verse 18 and cover the exhortations based on the superiority of the new covenant on Sunday morning, and then we'll try to get into at least part of chapter 13. So go ahead and get ready for chapter 13 as well.